As this is the 100th episode of the show, I thought I'd use this episode to go back and talk about the same comic I did the very first episode about, which was Warren Ellis, Declan Shalvey and Jordie Bellaire's Moon Knight. The topic this time though is something we talked a little bit about in the Creators Edition episode with Shalvey on the idea of pages entirely composed of horizontal panels. It's a pretty defining feature of this Moon Knight run, and actually quite a lot of Shalvey's work generally, with the majority of pages in every issue being made up of stacked, wide panels. So I wanted to dive further into how they work, what they appear to be doing, and why the technique is such an interesting one. You're watching the 100th episode of Strip Panel Naked. I'm Hass, and I'm going to show you some of the cool stuff lurking in the pages of some of the best comics. Okay, so there's really just these two things I want to talk about that Shalvey does with stacked panels when it comes to points of focus in the panels. And honestly, they're probably fairly obvious, but he either places the point of focus directly in the middle, or he splits the points of focus on the left and right, leaving a gap in the middle. So as an example of the former, here's the first page of issue 6, and if I put a line down the centre of the page, you can see how the main focal elements of every panel are directly placed in the centre. Initially it's Moon Knight, white and bold, then the detective, and then the officer who becomes our focus for the rest of the issue. There are other elements in the panels, obviously, like there's the dead body in the first panel, or you can see Moon Knight walking off in the second panel, but the main focus in those panels, the main thing for you to take away from that, is the interactions around the officer. Panel 1 has Moon Knight talking to him, and it's telling that Moon Knight is the focus in that panel. And similarly, in panel 2, the detective is the main focal point. We see his face directly in the middle, and the officer is pushed off to the side. It's only when he gets a little angry about the weird buddy, as he says, getting special treatment in panel 3, that the camera finally focuses in on him, and we realise it's his story. It's kind of a fun way of showing how this officer is always on the periphery, but now we get a chance to see what happens to him. And it tells a lot of story by keeping the focal elements in the middle, telling us as the reader that the important thing is in the middle, and therefore placing characters around that to create an extra dynamic to the storytelling. In issue 4, there's a page of Moon Knight in this dream world he's investigating, and it follows a similar concept. A straight line down the page reveals that everything falls directly on this line, and it essentially just gives you the obvious point of focus. So there was a clever video that you may have seen on the focal points in Mad Max Fury Road, which explained that every shot had its focal element directly in the middle, in an effort to keep the attention very directly in the same spot every frame. Shalvey seems to have a similar approach in Moon Knight, where guiding you straight down the middle gives you a page that's very easy to read and navigate. And it doesn't lose any dynamism, because you can still have things moving around the characters and around that central point of focus. It's not cut off. And you can see it from the very start of Moon Knight too. So the introduction to the character in the very first issue has a page that centrally focuses everything, leading you straight down to the logo and the costume reveal of Moon Knight. So you can see how it happens on kind of like a variation of different moments. But it also works on moments of action too. So if we jump back to issue 4, Moon Knight grabs and attacks this man, slamming his face into a table and dragging him from his chair before slamming him into the ground. Sticking that line back on the page once again shows a pretty definite central focus to the page. But this links into the point I was making a moment ago about not losing dynamism, because here you can see the other thing centrally framing pages does, which it gives them the impression of a static point that everything revolves around. The final panel, for example, has details spilling out beyond the middle of the panel, but everything feels like it gravitates towards that middle moment. The body, the papers, it's like they're flung from the centre. The same for the panel above, where the chair and desks and papers are on the right side, and even Moon Knight on the left side moving away. You can see the action on both the left and the right side of the panel, but it's the middle where it all comes together. It still holds focus even on panels that have a lot more going on in them. It's got a very simple approach to keeping everything centrally framed, but you can still have so much dynamism and so much action moving around it. It's really, really interesting. And the big part of making this work is the single vanishing point that Shalvey often brings in. In this page you can see how in the first panel all the lines converge towards the centre. In the second panel you've got the exact same thing, and the same in the third, and the fourth changes it by having the background become more expressive, but it essentially does the same thing of pulling the eye. So it's not just the fact that the main action takes place in the middle, but it's that the art is pulling you into the middle too. It's forcing your eye. It's a really good approach to make pages very easily readable. Because the reading order is just so simple, you just move down, you don't have to worry about left or right, or stack panels on one side and a big panel on the left, it's just very obvious. You're always following the action, because mostly it's just sat below the action above it. However, it also gives you that room on the left and right to be playful with the other information you need in the panels. It gives you a lot of space to work that tighter, narrower panels might not. In some cases, you can use those moments as a way of narrowing the panel, like the first panel of this page uses the doorway to basically shut off the left and the right sides, creating a panel within a panel. Or you can open it completely like the second panel, which suddenly uses the full left and right width to show Moon Knight throwing a man across the room. It may not seem that flexible an approach when you think of the idea of making every panel the same, but by using a few of those approaches, you can actually cheat the width quite easily, while sticking to the centrally framed images. Okay, so I said there was also a second way it uses horizontal panels, and it's linked to that idea, as a way to offset the visuals. A couple of pages later from this same issue, the first panel shows the man Moon Knight through on the floor, sat on the extreme right of the panel, and Chris Eliopoulos keeps their dialogue on the left side of the panel. So suddenly the panel feels a little odd, a little empty, and the power of the central imagery is gone, making the man kind of weaker by contrast. It's as though you can see him sliding away, leaving the room, leaving the panel, and placing the balloons on the left side attempts to keep the balance of the central framing still. It's a clever switch that controls the same language to give a new response. There's a moment in issue 6 with a similar trick, where the villain gets blown away by this car explosion. The final panel has him thrown on the right side, but again there's a visual element that's distinguished on the left side too, with this bit of shrapnel bouncing with a new colour that pops it on the page. So the panel is still balanced on both the left and the right side, which creates an almost awkward vacuum in the middle to propel the character on the right side. It gives it a new power and emphasis by contrast, but having that contrast not just appear panel to panel, but actually within the panel. The image is still balanced left and right to create a pocket of air, almost, in the middle of the frame. The central framing still kind of exists, but it's designed and built by having equal elements on left and right. And you see this pretty often, like this page of the Officer Training, where the middle panels create that same vacuum of imagery, or pocket of air, or whatever you want to call it, between the visuals on the left side and on the right side. This page from the first issue does it on every single panel, placing imagery very directly on the left side and on the right side. You've got cobwebs, Moon Knight in the room in the background, the two chairs. It's built by creating visuals that can draw the idea and generate a noticeable gap where the central image should be. So essentially the two techniques are built on the same approach. They both want to emphasize the middle of the panels, but in one instance they do that by having a key image directly in the middle, and on the other hand they do it by placing imagery on the left and the right side to make a gap in the middle. And it's all built on the framework of page after page of horizontally stacked panels, for the most part. I mentioned the idea of building a narrative language in this show a lot, but I think a lot of the best work has one. A specific approach and structure that builds the language of your comic. In this case, the horizontal panels focus readership. They give a very easy flow and readability to the pages, while building the idea of a central line down the pages that Shalvey and co can adapt and play around with for dynamic effect. In the case of Moon Knight, it's a big part of what made that 6-issue run a really interesting and special one. One with a clearly defined and dynamic visual approach. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy Strip Panel Naked, get access to tons and tons more exclusive writing and annotations on the Patreon page, where there's years worth of exclusive content there. You can follow me on Twitter at HassanOE, and find my Eisner-nominated magazine at panelxpanel.com, and of course hit subscribe and that notification bell to keep up to date with all the latest episodes, and I'll see you next time.